That's a siren in the background. New York has been on lockdown for about 2 or 3 weeks now, trying to flatten the curve of the coronavirus. And it's Saturday, April 4th, as I record this. Although I kind of need to look at a calendar to figure out the day of the week, because they all kind of blend together when you don't leave your apartment and when it's the same 4 walls that you look at every hour of every day for weeks. In such, I'm going to go ahead and say, unprecedented circumstances, it can really be hard to make yourself get up out of bed and focus on something other than survival, to do some thinking, to do some art making, to do some work of any kind. But I think it's important to try, and I'm going to try. I'm going to try now to respond in some semi-intelligent manner to everything that I've seen on TV, outside my window, on my news feed, and to hopefully try to bring it together into some form of sense. So my hope is going to be to respond to all of this in a 2-part episode. Today's episode, which is going to be the state of the world today, and next episode, which is going to be called the state of the world tomorrow. And the intention is to end on some kind of an optimistic note, because I think it's important to be optimistic in times like these. And I say times like these as if times like these have ever happened before. But I think it's important to be optimistic now. But of course, before you can be optimistic, you have to take stock of the situation as it is. So today's episode is going to focus on what we have. And what we have is a gloomy world where it's difficult to look weeks or years or decades into the future and see anything other than a black hole. And I don't just mean the events of the last weeks and months, but of the last years and decades. I'm not just talking about coronavirus, I'm also talking about climate change and the rise of neo-fascism in Europe, the erosion of democracy in the United States, the ever-escalating class war that's been going on in this country and in most countries around the globe. In other words, if I were to try to describe the world of 2020, I'd call it a futureless world. A world where suddenly there's this gaping black hole where the future should be. How did we get here? And how do we get back out? How do we reinstate the future? That is going to be the subject of the next 2 episodes. So, here we are. This is capital A, episode 6, The State of the World Today. I want to start my exploration of the world that I see outside my window with kind of a personal anecdote. It involves an observation that my father made to me a few years ago. And if you know me, or if you know my family, you know that I was born in the Soviet Union. That's where my family comes from. And my father was no particular lover of that system. He was a dissident, albeit a very kind of quiet, very minor dissident. And the first chance that he got, he escaped the Soviet Union and came to the United States looking for, the things that people used to come to America to look for, a better future. Nevertheless, despite his deep reservations about the country that he left behind, he once said something that really stuck with me, which was that in the Soviet Union, all sci-fi films were utopias. And in the United States, they're all dystopias. And when you think about it, it's true, isn't it? When's the last time you watched a movie about the future where that future was presented to you as a good one? Usually, it's some kind of dark, gritty, cyberpunk world where you have to be tough just to survive, and some maniacal corporation or some evil empire is trying to extend its reach further and further across the galaxy. Or else, Black Mirror style, it's some kind of world that's very similar to our world today, but in which technology plays an ever wider, ever more insidious role. And where systems of control are becoming more and more pervasive, kind of eroding our sense of what it means to have self-determination. That's the vision that Hollywood and its affiliated studios around the world have when they look into the future. And what does it say about our society that that is what our cultural imaginary sees when it looks years, decades, or centuries into the future? By contrast, what does it mean that the Soviet Union, which was a society renowned for its human rights violations and for daily administration of lies to its populace, what does it mean that that society produced some of the most optimistic visions of life in the 21st century and beyond that humanity has ever produced? Far from being a kind of, incidental footnote in the annals of cultural history, I think this irony is key to understanding the gloomy state of the world today, this kind of pervasive general anxiety about what's around the corner that we all try to kind of keep under wraps, keep under control, like sweep under the rug and just keep going with, keep going in spite of. And I think the thing to notice here, again, is that this is not new. This is not coronavirus related, right? Like, when did Waterworld come out? Like, when was Blade Runner? I think it was, 79? I could be wrong about that. It's in the 80s, I think. The point is that this has been the future that we have seen for ourselves for decades now. And contrast that with the kind of future that we imagined was ours before that. Contrast that with earlier visions of America's future in particular, but also the world's future in general, right? Starting with a city on the hill, manifest destiny, the American dream, leader of the free world. Contrast that with all the visions of progress from the early to high modernist period, right? The French revolutionary vision of liberty guiding the people, the Hegelian dialectical vision of spirit actualizing itself in the world, the Marxist vision of the internal contradictions of capital pushing us towards a better, brighter horizon. Contrast that even with the optimistic moment in the early 90s, right after the Soviet Union fell, and it felt to everyone like the good guys had won, and from now on we're all going to be on the same side, right? A better future was just around the corner for all humanity. That didn't last. And it's the subject of this episode to figure out why. And I think what we're talking about here is the fact that people no longer really believe in progress, right? When you say that you no longer think that tomorrow will be better than today, what you're saying is that you don't believe in progress. And there are many reasons for this. Some people believe that it was the experience of the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II that gave the lie to the theory of progress. Others point to the fact that a theory of progress and enlightenment was often used to justify French and British and American colonial ambitions, and that these theories of progress have caused incredible amounts of suffering throughout the world. The French philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard argued that the idea of progress dies when science, whose job it is to debunk myth, debunks the myth of progress on which the scientific project is founded. The economist Thomas Piketty recently has become famous for arguing that the world had been moving in a positive economic direction with less and less disparity, more and more income equality, right through the mid to late 70s until the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, reversed decades of careful economic policy and started us down the long, vertiginous road to the unconscionable levels of injustice and inequality that we see today. All of these are good theories, but as traumatic as the experience of World War II and post-colonialism was, as Piketty has pointed out, there were decades of progressive, forward-looking policies put in place after that. It wasn't until the 1980s that we kind of changed course and started heading towards this, what he calls neo-proprietarian ideology that eventually gave us the world that we have today. And for me, the key question isn't even why Reagan and Thatcher won election in 1980, but rather why the forces of progress didn't rally in the election cycle after that, or the election cycle after that, or the election cycle after that, and put a stop to these disastrous policies, rather than doing what they did do, which was to elect Bill Clinton in the United States and Tony Blair in the United Kingdom, who were not at all progressives, even though they wore that mantle, but who were instead representatives of this new direction in so-called left-of-center politics, which was essentially just neoliberalism with a human face. For the last 30 years, whether it's been a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House, the wealth gap has gotten wider. And it really doesn't matter what Clinton said he stood for, or what Obama said he stood for. The effects were the same. So for me, the question is, why did the forces of progress suddenly give up? Well, when I look back on those years at the end of the 20th century, it seems to me that the only event that was even large enough to begin to explain this surrender of the vision of progress was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, what I don't mean to suggest is that the Soviet Union was some kind of standard bearer for liberty and equality for all humanity. Far from it. But when you look back on it, it's hard to escape the impression that there was something structurally necessary about the Soviet Union's existence as an alternative to the West to kind of keep the Western powers on their best behavior. And anyway, an event of the magnitude of the collapse of the Soviet Union must have had some kind of impact on the collective cultural and political psyche of the time. In order to start feeling our way towards what this impact might have been, I want to start by playing a clip from one of my favorite philosophers, someone who has fallen dramatically out of favor with today's academic left, but that's neither here nor there. Slavoj Žižek. This is from a talk that Žižek gave in November of 2015 at the Deutsches Schauspielhaus in Hamburg.
Today, the very idea of a radical social transformation appears as an impossible dream. But this term, impossible, should make us think. Impossible and possible are distributed in strange ways today. On the one hand, in the domain of personal freedoms and scientific technology, we are told again and again how nothing is impossible. We can enjoy sex in all its perverse versions. Entire archives of music, films are available for downloading. Going to space is available to everyone. Okay, everyone with money. There is even the prospect of enhancing our physical, psychic abilities, of manipulating our genetic base up to the Gnostic dream of achieving immortality by way of transforming our identity into a software, and then we just download ourselves into a new hardware. So again, everything is possible. On the other hand, especially in the domain of socio-economic relations, our era perceives itself as the era of maturity, in which, with the collapse of communist states, humanity finally has abandoned the old millenarian dreams and accepted the constraints of reality, which means, of course, capitalist reality, with all its impossibilities. You cannot engage in large collective acts, which we are told always end in totalitarian terror, cling to the old welfare state, it makes you non-competitive, and so on and so on. So this is for me the basic paradox. Everything is possible, but you cannot raise the taxes to finance culture for 1%. That's impossible. You ruin everything and so on. So again, our first task is to be always aware that when we are told this is possible, this is not possible, and so on, we are talking about ideology, not about cold facts.
So Žižek is making a subtle point here about how ideology functions. But what interests me for the moment is the broader context that he couches this in. Quote, "Our era perceives itself as the era of maturity, in which, with the collapse of communist states, humanity finally has abandoned the old millenarian dreams and accepted the constraints of reality, which means, of course, capitalist reality, with all its impossibilities." What he's talking about here is the end of history. And I think the end of history is really what we've been talking about this whole time. That is the name for the condition that we find ourselves in, where it feels like we've come to the end of the road and there's nothing further down the line. It's a deceptively complex idea that takes on many shapes. Most people associate it with Hegel, although as far as I can tell, Hegel himself never used the term and might not have agreed with it himself. Obviously, there was the version of it put forward by Karl Marx, the communist horizon towards which all of human history is tending. But we also encountered it last episode in the kind of unspoken ideology around contemporary art being the end of the line for art history. Remember that the story goes something like in the 1960s, art finally broke the last of its own rules, and now there's nowhere further for it to go. From here on out, everything would be allowed to the artist, but at the same time, there would be no more movements, no more manifestos, no more sense of collective march towards art's future. And this may all sound pretty abstract, but I think this feeling is one that many of us will be familiar with. I think we've all probably had at some point in our lives that experience of coming to the end of some goal or project that's been structuring our lives for a very long time. And instead of this feeling of jubilation that we were expecting, we suddenly get this strange malaise, this disorientation, this, well, where do I go from here? That's what the end of history is, but on a global level.
This idea Zizek is referring to, that with communism gone, capitalism is the only game left in town.
And indeed, whether or not this is the moment that all of history has been building towards, it is undeniable that capitalism seems to be the last man standing. No thinker has done more to push this idea that, with the collapse of communism, capitalism wins and crowns itself the end state of human evolution than the American political thinker Francis Fukuyama. If you go to Google today and you type in end of history, the first few hits you get will not be Karl Marx nor Hegel, but Francis Fukuyama. And that's because at the end of the 80s,
Fukuyama wrote an essay called The End of History,
in which he argues that this basic idea that history has been building towards some kind of concluding point, some kind of horizon, this idea is essentially correct. But unlike the communist horizon of Karl Marx's thought, for Francis Fukuyama, the end of history was precisely the consumer capitalist liberal democracy that seemed to be gaining ground all around the world in the early 90s. A universal state characterized by, quote, liberal democracy in the political sphere combined with easy access to VCRs and stereos in the economic. Here is a representative passage. Quote, surely the class issue has actually been successfully resolved in the West. As Geoff, among others, noted, the egalitarianism of modern America represents the essential achievement of the classless society envisioned by Marx. End quote. Now, it's really easy to make fun of Fukuyama here. I mean, this essay that he wrote eventually got published in book length in 1992, the same year as the Rodney King riots, and racial and economic conflict in the United States has only gotten more intense since then. But I think to make fun of it is to miss its essential dimension, which is that whether or not you've actually read Fukuyama, this is the baseline ideology most of us are operating under. This idea that the ideological struggle is over, that capitalism has won, and that is the end state of human society, the final form of human organization, that idea is current and accepted and essentially undisputed, even by the most radical proponents of progressive policymaking. The idea for, in the United States, Elizabeth Warren or even Bernie Sanders is not to overthrow capitalism, right? It's just to move a few things around, put on capitalism's Sunday best, give free healthcare to people, give free tuition to people, not like overthrow the system entirely, just make it manageable, make it livable. That idea, that all you have to work with from now on is the system that we have today, and the best that you can do is to make minor or major improvements to it, that idea is the intellectual legacy of the collapse of the Soviet Union. As Zizek says, we are all Fukuyamaists today. Now, this isn't entirely true. Actually, in the last few years, what's been remarkable is the emergence, suddenly, of several alternative visions for how to organize human society that are neither capitalism nor really communism, but something else, something new. And that to me is really exciting, and that's something that I'll get into in the next episode. But for the remainder of this episode, I want to finish in the last few minutes here by just taking a brief look at some of the psychological impacts of believing that you have reached the end of history, which is, again, the assumption that all of us have been operating under from 1991 until basically yesterday. Now, it's really hard to say something intelligent about what is a very broad subject that you could probably write a book about in the last few minutes of one episode of a podcast about art. But I'm just going to attempt a very brief sketch here of the experiential qualities of living at the end of history. And interestingly enough, I think it was Fukuyama himself who kind of pointed the way towards the kind of malaise that develops when you reach the end of history. Remember that up until now, Fukuyama has celebrated the end of history as this glorious time when capitalism wins the ideological struggle and mankind is united all across the globe in the brotherhood of democracy and cheap appliances. And then, almost out of nowhere, in a flash of insight, he ends his essay on the following note, quote, "The end of history will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. In the post-historical period, there will neither be art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the museum of human history. I can feel in myself and see in others around me a powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed. Such nostalgia, in fact, will continue to fuel competition and conflict, even in the post-historical world, for some time to come. Even though I recognize its inevitability, I have the most ambivalent feelings for the civilization that has been created in Europe since 1945 with its North Atlantic and Asian offshoots. Perhaps this very prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history will serve to get history started once again." Sound familiar? This description is precisely the world that we live in today. It's a world of a crisis in agency, to use Natalie Jeremijenko's term. A world where economics replaces politics, where consumption replaces participation, where technocrats rule the world and scoff at anyone foolish enough to embarrass themselves by displaying conviction. A world where art and philosophy are not really proposing anything new, just continual interpretations and commentary on the past. This is what it means to live at the end of history. This is what it means to believe that you have exhausted all possibilities, that what you have now is all you will ever have, and that nothing will ever change again. It's this depressive belief that all possibilities are exhausted and there's nothing further to do, there are no more choices left. It's this idea that causes people to vote for a Joe Biden, this mannequin for the end times, because at least what he's selling you is the idea that you had no other choice, right? That it's okay to abandon the ideals of your youth. You're not a sellout. You're a realist. Communism failed. Europe is a parallel dimension. Neoliberal economic policy with some measure of civic civility is all that we have left. There is no other realistic choice. And you, my friend, far from being a sellout, you're just one of the smart, savvy ones to realize it. Now, personally, I've always felt that you have to be kind of crazy to buy into this reasoning because, after all, just a brief glance at human history tells us that the human condition, by which I mean that which is and that which experts tell us is and is not possible, that changes dramatically every 30 or 40 years, right? Like what the experts told us was and was not possible in the Eisenhower era is completely different from what people are telling us is and is not possible today. But in order to kind of understand that, what you need is a firm grasp of your place within the historical trajectory. And unfortunately, one of the characteristics of life at the end of history is precisely a feeling of disjunction between your lived experience day to day and all of the history that came before you. This feeling of being divorced from the historical trajectory that led up to your being where you are right now. And this is a phenomenon that Frederick Jameson, another writer writing around the same period as Fukuyama, called the eternal present. And
Sadly, I don't think I have time to go into the intricacies of what Jameson meant by the eternal present. It's a very complicated notion, has to do with nostalgia films, style, period pieces, and schizophrenia. So instead of trying to go into all of that, I think the best thing that I can do is just illustrate really quickly with an anecdote from my own life, which is that about 2 or 3 years ago, must have been, I was driving upstate to visit my father, and I pulled over on the side of the highway at a rest area, which had one of those historical plaques that said something like, in such a year in the 18th century, such and such a battle was fought between British forces and continental soldiers on this hill. And I looked around myself, and all I saw around me was this highway rest stop, and a McDonald's in the background, a way station for 18-wheelers, some fields, and I couldn't, for the life of me, picture that this place that I was standing in was trampled over by retreating redcoats and their continental, army pursuers. I just couldn't place myself in that same dimension of reality. And I think one of the ways that I've seen this expressed best in fiction was in Ray Bradbury's Dandelion Wine, which is this collection of short stories set in a rural town. And one of the characters is this old grandmother who is trying to find a way to communicate with the children of the town. And the way that she tries to do this is by telling them, I used to be young too. There once was a time when I was your age, and she tries to convince them of this. And she finds, to her surprise, that rather than bringing her closer to them, it makes them really uncomfortable. And finally, she figures out that, she'll actually make them more comfortable by telling them that she's always been old, that there was never a time when she, this, wrinkled old lady, was the same age as them. And that experience, her childhood and her youth, was essentially lived out in a dimension completely separate from their reality of the present at that time. All of that goes to say that I think, for a variety of very complicated reasons that Jameson goes into, and I think many other people have also gone into, it's really hard to really picture yourself as being part of the same reality as Mayan astronomers, Spanish conquistadors, Bolshevik revolutionaries, Sumerian warlords. All of that history doesn't feel real. It feels like it belongs in a book. And the real is the real that you see before you day to day. And it feels like it has never changed, like it has always been what it is today, even if you've lived through significant historical changes in your life. My father always says that the life that he lived in the Soviet Union feels like it has happened to someone else. That his life now in upstate New York, that feels like the reality. And the Soviet Union era of his life, which was half of his life, feels like it was an entirely different reality. But what's even more surprising, perhaps, is that even my grandfather said this. My grandfather, who lived in the United States only the last 7 years of his life, also said to me once, I've only been here for a few years, but already I feel like that entire lifetime lived in the Soviet Union was a dream. That's the eternal present. The illusion that what you see before you is all that there ever was and all that there ever will be. And, it is an illusion. It's a particularly powerful illusion and a politically charged illusion that allows the forces of hegemony to maintain their hold on the cultural imaginary and, convince you that you have to be a fool to expect something better, and you have to be crazy to try for something better. But it is an illusion nonetheless. And to bring this all back to the point at which we started, I think the reason for that is The system that we have today, what Fukuyama termed the universal state, characterized by liberal democracy in the political sphere and easy access to VCRs and appliances in the economic sphere, that system is not a system of the future. It is not a system that promises you a better tomorrow. It is a system that promises you X, Y, and Z experiences today. And nothing is more threatening to that system than the imagination, than the ability of a subject to imagine a future, the ability of a subject to claim its own past and project itself into the future via one or another historical project, because it is fundamentally a system of hegemony. It is fundamentally a system that wants to be all that there is to be, and any kind of alternative imagination is a threat to it. That is why all Soviet sci-fi films were utopias and why all American sci-fi films are dystopias. The message that is being sent when we create, multi-million-dollar dystopian films is that any kind of a change is a bad thing. We have reached the end of history. This is all that we will ever have. It may not be good, you may not like it, but all the alternatives are worse. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, capitalist democracy is the worst system of government in history, except for all the other systems that have ever been tried. And the irony here is that the fundamental ideology of liberal capitalism is self-contradicting. On the one hand, it is presented to you as the worst possible system except for all the other systems that have ever been tried. On the other hand, it is also the only possible system, the end goal of human evolution. So the lesson of the American sci-fi film is both that change is impossible and that change is not desirable. And again, to pick up on something Zizek said, when you come to that kind of point of impossibility, that kind of point of contradiction, you know that what you're dealing with is not cold, hard facts, but ideology. The price for which you pay every day that you look into the future and all you see is a deep black hole. But of course, a world like that cannot last for long. And next episode, I want to explore how the events of the last decade or so, both our accumulating understanding of the threat posed by climate change and what we see around us today, this unprecedented crisis of the coronavirus, which is very much a crisis of capitalism, have begun to put pressure on that ideology so that finally we are beginning to see cracks in that heretofore impregnable edifice. That's it. That's all I've got for today. Before I sign off here, I just want to say thank you really quickly to the grocery store clerks, agricultural workers, transportation workers, utility personnel, medical personnel, all the people that are risking their lives, putting on a mask and going outside to keep this country running for the sake of you and me, the people that are sheltering in place. As Michael Moore said on his podcast, these are the people that we call essential. But with the exception of doctors and the members of a few public employees unions who are paid pretty well, these are also the people whose health insurance we're always trying to take away. These are the people we're trying to deport. These are the people that we're trying to evict. These are the people we're trying to indebt to credit card companies. The people that we just don't give a fuck about. The essential personnel. And, this was true under Obama and Clinton as much as it was true under Trump and Bush and Bush. It's hard to speak on this with the same kind of moral clarity that Michael Moore is able to summon, but I encourage everyone to listen to his podcast, to get just a more visceral sense of the situation. And thank you also to everyone that tuned into this episode. It was a really tough one for me to record, but I hope that you got something out of it. And I hope that if you did get something out of it, you'll help me out a little bit by liking, sharing, subscribing, the whole 9 yards. And I hope that you'll tune in next time when when it's my intention to have something a bit more positive to say. Until then, this has been Capital A.
Liebes Kind, komm, geh mit mir, gar schöne Spiele spiel ich mit dir. Manch bunte Blumen sind an dem Strand, meine Mutter hat manch Gülden gewandt. Mein Vater, und hörest du nicht, was Erlenkönig mir leise verspricht? Sei ruhig, bleibe ruhig, mein Kind, in dürren Blättern säuselt der Wind. Willst, feiner Knabe, du mit mir gehen, meine Töchter sollen dich warten schön, meine Töchter führen den nächtlichen Rhein und wiegen und tanzen und singen dich ein, und wiegen und tanzen und singen dich ein. Mein Vater,